Ray Ives, dependent of underdog here. Thank you for joining. This one's probably going to be short, but it's really interesting, and it's a good part of the story. So, part 3 of the book, The Pen of an Underdog, and this subchapter is leaving with grace and generosity. Long story short, leading up to this point, I got the job in Cincinnati after traveling on my own dime, making arrangements, all after travel was denied internally at my company. So I made the interviews on my own dime. I scheduled time. I took personal days, ended up getting the job. And this is what I knew. I knew that I had to leave, but I wanted to do that with grace because the role, the category analyst role that I had, for over 2 years was such an integral part of their category management team. I had access to the test kitchen, the mock grocery store, and it was such a big part that I knew if I left abruptly, it was going to cause some conflict, and I didn't want that. And so I wanted to create sort of this win-win situation where I would find a replacement. And I was never asked to do this. I wasn't asked to go out there and find a replacement. I knew that this was the right thing to do. So I started asking. I had 2 friends, Boise Burnham and Montrose Vu. Boise was interesting. He super energetic, distance runner, Toastmasters, great speaker, one of the greatest guys. He was in food science. And so I started asking, do you know anybody that'd be interested in the category analyst role within the deli bakery department? Great opportunity. Then I started talking to Montrose. Montrose was, if you could meet anybody described as salt of the earth, he was just the nicest guy, pure heart. He was Lebanese, deep black hair, charming. He was squirrely, loved cross country skiing. He loved going out to Lake Minnetonka, just hanging out. It was like, this was a nice guy. I would trust him with everything in my life. So I started talking to Montrose, and Montrose is, like my brother-in-law, Evander, is having a hard time. He's been out of work for a while and really don't know what to do. What is he doing now? And he was in finance. Now, finance is a different world, right? He was in a different world. But 2 things. If you're coachable and likable, you could cross industries. You could cross departments. You can do essentially anything with those 2 traits. And Evander had those. So I was like, okay, Montrose, set it up. I'll meet Evander. We'll go through this. He knows you're my friend. And let's go from there. So we met at Montrose's house. We had a great introduction, and he was interested in the role. He saw the value in being a category analyst at a Fortune 50 plus company. So I knew that a couple things had to change, and I had to help Evander. And I wanted to help him. I wanted to help him because he was Montrose's brother-in-law. I wanted to help him because he was a good person. And so the first thing I did was work with him on his resume. There's a lot of good stuff there, but that was built for finance. We needed to deconstruct and reconstruct for retail grocery. And so we started plugging and wordsmithing keywords and phrases and got his resume to a point that was like, okay, although he doesn't have retail grocery or wholesale experience, he has something on the analytical side that will transfer over. So that was the first step. And then the second step was helping Evander use Microsoft Excel. He wasn't very familiar with it. He was using different applications. And so started going through Microsoft Excel. So we were at Montrose's house. I had to spend 3 hours with him and gave him homework. And this included data sets. Again, confidential data sets. He was from a different industry. And I showed him, I basically gave him a behind the scenes peek, a peek behind the curtain of what I did on a daily basis, the data I looked at, the system it came from. And we went through these exercises, basically training, exporting data, manipulating, formatting it, getting into a usable and readable format that decision makers wanted. And so spent a lot of time with him on this. And then the last thing I remember I did for him, I was like, okay, you're going to have an interview. You're going to have an interview with Medea, who's my boss, and myself. Here's the catch. She's going to ask you some questions. I have an idea of what those questions are going to be. And I shared those. I said, she'll probably ask you this, this, and this. And then I told him I'm going to give him some layups. I'm going to give him some meatballs and say, okay, I'm going to ask you this question. Here's the answer. And I remember typing out the questions with the answer. And then we rehearsed them. So in the interview, everything was lined up. His resume was lined up. His ability to speak through functions Excel and category analytics, that was set up. And finally, the questions were set up. Now, here's where I feel okay with that. This was the right candidate based on the timeline, the urgency. He was likable. He was coachable. He was smart. He was doing a lot of work for a big bank, and he was trained by a big bank. And so transferring that over to this position, he came with a lot of qualities. He just didn't have the experience, and people get caught up in that experience. Again, if somebody was coachable and likable, which Evander was, it was going to happen. So long story short, I remember being in an interview. Evander, Medea went extremely well. And from that point, I said, Evander, now it's on you to go out and meet the corporate team. You're going to go meet the corporate team. Just be you. Speak to a lot of things that we talked about, elaborate on them, so on and so forth. Evander ended up getting the job. So the transition was very easy. I left with grace. The generosity was really my time in helping Evander, spend a lot of hours with Evander and sharing information and taking the time to really work with him and say, look, you're a friend of my friend. I am going to help you in whatever way I can. I'm going to go above and beyond expectations for you, myself, and just for the good of humanity. You're going to get this job. I'm going to ensure that you get this job. And that's what happened. He got the job, and I was off to Cincinnati. I covered all my bases. Everyone was happy. There was no turmoil between Deetra, the sister who denied travel. Everything was smooth sailing. So I share these stories, again, because there's golden nuggets in here, I believe, through my experience. And I want to share because as you're going through and you're trying to figure out what next you're going to do, like that part of authenticity, that part of purpose-driven, of having vision, right? It all comes down to understanding where you were and where you want to go, but in an authentic way. And so let's stay connected. Ray Ives, The Pen of an Underdog. It's on Amazon. Take the shortcut. Read it. It's, again, I'm not trying to sell books, but I think it's an interesting read. It's like no other. So thanks for joining. Hit subscribe. Let's stay connected.